Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video, we're going to create custom UITableView cells so that in our table view, we can have a custom look and feel depending upon what kind of data we need to show in those cells. And I'm going to show you how to make everything from the height to different elements in the table view cell. So let's get started. So I started off this project with just a single view application. And so we'll start from here. And the first thing that we're going to want to do is press the Command-Shift-L key to bring up our palette of elements here. I'm just going to type in TableView. And so TableView controller will actually create an entire view controller here. We don't want that one. We just want this TableView as a view itself. And I'm going to drag this in and I'm going to position it so that it fills up our entire screen here. And then over on the left-hand side of our inspector, I'm going to hold down the Control key, click and drag up to our view, and we're going to set the constraints for the leading, the top, the trailing, and the bottom views. And that way it will lock the constraints or the edges of our view to its parent view inside our view controller here, so it takes up the full screen. And of course, if you want to make it slightly different, if you want to have some space at the top here, you can do that as well. Just drag it down. I'm going to undo that. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the class that our view controller is using. And so if you select up here until it's selected, you can see that it's using the view controller class that we have defined here on the left-hand side. And of course you can change this, but we're just going to use the default that Xcode created for us. And what we need to do is tell this table view inside of our view controller that our view controller is going to be the code that is going to supply our which table or which rows in our table view are going to be shown. So to do that, we just control drag from our table view here on the left up to our view controller class. And again, because this view controller is being controlled by the view controller class that's defined here, it'll set our data source and delegate by selecting these outlets to it. So select the delegate and then our data source, again, control, click and drag up to our view controller and do it this way. Alternatively, you can also do it from the UI here. You can click and drag and select it up to this this icon here on the left-hand side, and it does the same thing. So whatever you prefer, there's many ways to do that. All right, so once we have our table view selected, I'm going to actually jump over to our view controller and set up our delegate functions and data source functions for this. So the way that we do that, if you haven't seen our previous video on UITableViews, is we just add it here after it's comma separated. So I'm just going to type in table view and our pop-up will allow us to select different elements here. So UITableView delegate's the first one we want, and then we also want the UITableView data source, which doesn't come up immediately, so just keep typing it out until just data source, there we go, until we see it coming up in the list, where you can type the whole thing out, whatever you want. All right, so now that we have these two interfaces that we're implementing, Swift is going to, or Xcode I should say, is going to complain that we're saying we're implementing that interface, but we're not actually doing it. So would you like to put in those stubs in order to satisfy those requirements? So if you just go ahead and click on that stop sign with a circle in it, it'll bring up this menu and you just hit fix and it'll put those functions in for me. Now I like to put these kind of near the bottom because I do like my view did load at the top. So I'm just gonna put those at the bottom, no big deal. And the ones that it filled in, these stubs, are number of rows in section. So this will tell us how many rows are in our table view. And we're just going to populate it with some basic data. Actually, I like to put in a few more rows just so we can see how it scrolls. So I'm going to put in 15 rows that are hard-coded. The next thing we're going to need to do, and again, I'm going through this quickly because we've already had a video on this, but I need to get a cell, a table view cell, and the way that we do that is we dequeue it from the table view. So the table view that's being passed in our function here for our table view, because again, we're the delegate for this and the data source, is we say, hey, table view, dequeue reusable cell with identifier. All right, so we haven't set up the cell yet, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a custom string here for our cell, and our cell we're going to call just custom cell. All right, I'll show you in a second where we get that from. If there is no current cell in the table view, it'll actually create one for us and then assign it to that cell variable. So once we have the cell variable, we want to return it. And obviously this doesn't do anything useful at the moment, but if you want to fill it in with some data, we have three different areas that we can put this data. So one, if we just type in label, we have a text label, and then we also have a detail label. So let me show you what this looks like really quickly. We're going to do text on our text label. So we're going to set the text on our text label. This is going to be the main text area. It's going to be the larger text. And then as I mentioned, we also have the details text label. I'm going to set the text on that label to details. And then finally, for our default cell, TableView cell that comes in, we have our image view. And so on our image view, we can set the image for this particular one. Now I don't have any placeholder ones in this particular project, but again, if you wanted to put in an image in your TableView cell, that would have a placeholder on the left-hand side, and whether you set that will kind of determine what the layout of our default cell is. So I'm going to comment that out. I'll keep it in the source code. I'll put a link in the description below for where you can get the source code for this. But so we're just going to go ahead and keep these two labels so I can show you where those are, and then we're going to customize the view. Let's go ahead and fix some of these unwrapping. There we go. We'll fix this in a second. That's not exactly what I want to do. If you ever see yourself doing a lot of these exclamation points, it's probably a bad thing, and you really do need to check whether these items exist or not. Okay, so we ran our application and immediately it crashed, and that's because our cell is coming back as nil. As I mentioned, if you're doing this exclamation point, you best be very careful because it could be nil, and what putting the exclamation point is saying is basically, no, it's okay, just take it as is. But the reason is because we haven't set the custom cell on that. So I just wanted to show you how that works. Now, before we do anything else, we're going to go ahead and go into our main storyboard. And inside of our table view, if I click on that, make sure it's selected, I can go over to our attributes panel here on the side. And right now it's going to be dynamic prototypes. I want to drop down the content. So right now it's dynamic prototypes, and that's actually what we want. But the number of prototype cells is right now is 0. And so I'm going to set that to 1 so that you can see that now there's a cell in there, or a row in that. If I do 2, you can see that there's 2 rows. This is not how we control how many rows go in, but this is just saying if I want to have multiple types of rows, so maybe one row is an image and another is a block of text. So if you think to the Facebook application, how as you're scrolling through your feed, some of those feeds are images plus text, some of those other images are, or rows are just text, etc. So this is one way of doing that. So we have a prototype cell now in here, and if I click, make sure that you have TableView cell selected. If I have the TableView and we have maybe multiple prototypes here, you can see that there's 2 different areas that we can select. So just make sure that your TableView cell is selected so we can see this reuse identifier. If you remember, what actually is the problem here is we have a identifier custom cell, but we haven't actually given any cell that label. So again, select our TableView cell. We're going to paste that in there. So we have that one. And then if you want to have 2 of these, I can give it another cell identifier. And that way, again, if you're having different custom cells and you need one with a little bit more or a little bit less or different looking UI, you can select the correct cell that you need based on this identifier. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is we're going to drag this down so that we get like a couple different heights here. So you can see that this one has a little bit smaller height than this one. This is not going to set it in our application. We can do that manually depending upon the cell type, But what you can do is if you select on that custom cell, which is now named because we gave it the identifier, you can go and click on this ruler so that we have on the right hand side what the height actually is, and we can say row height. Let's just make that an even 100, and then down here this is 160. Let's make that 175. All right, and this is just a way to lay out your UI and get these numbers. And if you want these numbers hard-coded, right now we're just going to do one cell, but you can extrapolate this and figure out how to do the other cell. But what we're going to do is we're going to programmatically add that height in. So what I like to do is just type in TableView, and you get all your TableView delegate methods and data source methods. And if you just keep typing, you don't even need to put spaces here. I'm just going to type in height so that we get this height for row at. So we're going to select that one, and it changes everything to what the definition of the method should be. Let's give ourselves a little bit of space here. All right, so this method is expecting a CG float or Core Graphics float value. So you can just think about that as a regular float. So I'm going to return, our first one was 100 pixels, right? So we can do 100.0, just ensure that's a float. And that's all we need to do. Okay, so a row for every row will be 100 pixels. Now, again, I'd put in some logic to determine what kind of cell I would need and put the height in here so you can control it programmatically. Real quick, I'm going to comment out this line of code just because our detailed text label is not actually there, and then hence that's why we need that unwrap exclamation point. So we're going to run this, and we can see that we have 15 rows of just basically the same thing. Our rows are a little bit larger or taller than the default. So let's go ahead and customize this now. Let's go back to our main storyboard, and this is our cell that we're going to customize. So Command-Shift-L will bring up our palette for this. You can also select this button up here that does the same thing up in the top right-hand corner. All right, so this one I just want a few labels. So I'm going to drag that in here. I'm going to position it kind of where I want it. And I'm going to Alt or Option drag so we have another label. And I'm going to do that a third time, Alt Option and drag down. And I'm going to set these constraints here. So I'm going to select this one up to the top row and then the vertical spacing so that everything fits in nicely. I'm going to make sure that this is on the right hand side, and of course it always resizes this for me, but that's okay. It's just the order of how we put in those constraints. Should have done the width first. Okay, so we have that, but then we need right and left. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to add in an image view. So I'm going to drag that in. Of course it's going to be way too big, but that's okay. We're going to resize that to where we need it and set up our constraints. So Control drag up, top, Control drag to the left, leading, Control drag to the bottom. And now I don't have a constraint for the right hand side, so it doesn't know how big to make it. So I'm going to go down here in the bottom right hand corner with this square and add a constraint for the width. And right now it's at 75, and that's pretty good. So a nice round number. All right, so now we have a width. Now we can set the left-hand side of these labels to be that far from there, and we should have all of our constraints set up. All right, so now the tricky part is how do we set these labels programmatically as well as this image view? So they all work basically the same, but the trick to this is in our custom cell here, we have to set up a custom class to handle the logic and how all this is displayed. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new class for this row. So I'm just going to go up to, I'm going to right click on this folder, go to new file, Cocoa Touch class, hit next, and then we're going to call this one custom TableView cell. And just make sure the subclass is of TableView, not controller, but cell. Okay, so custom table view cell, you can name that whatever you want, of course, and then hit next, and we're going to save it into that same folder. Okay, so here's our class for that table view cell. And normally when you have a view controller, you can open up the right-hand side. So just clicked on this kind of double circle, and we can look at our UI and we can look at the code for that UI. Just make sure automatic is selected here. And again, normally if you wanted to have a reference to that table view, you can certainly do that by control clicking and dragging over here and just calling it whatever you want, table view in our case, so we have a reference to it. But we can't do that for our cell because one, there's going to be 15 of these things in this particular example, and two, we don't know exactly which cell it is. So we're going to go over to automatic, and you can see that our table view cell is not available. Now we haven't set the class yet, so let's go ahead and do that first. So it's just using the default UITableView cell that comes with iOS. So we're going to set that to our custom TableView cell and just type in one letter and it works. All right, make sure that inherit module from target is selected. Sometimes if you do this in the reverse order, that doesn't quite work. And so now that we have this cell set up, sometimes our automatic selection will work, but most of the time it doesn't. So we have to go up to just make sure our custom cell is selected here, and then go up to manual, and then go find that class to display on the right-hand side. So this is a little trick that you might not be able to see right away. So now that we have our custom TableView cell class on the right-hand side, we can now hook up these labels. So click into them till the labels are selected, control drag over, and we're just going to call this main. I'm just going to call it main label, and do that for our other labels. So this one, if you're trying to display a date for your data, you might call it date label, something like that. Obviously give them descriptive names to help you. And I don't know, let's call this one description label. And then finally our image view. Just make sure you're not selecting, just put it right. Stick it in the middle there. All right, so sometimes there's a little bug here. It says it could not find any information on the class name description label. I don't know why it does that. Oftentimes it's because it gets confused on where you're trying to put it in the code. So usually I'll just create a little space and make sure that I drag and drop that into a clear space. Let's call this image view, capital V, and there we go. So it just fixes that little bug. In case you ever see that, it happens to me quite a bit, but that's the workaround, is just try not to stick those labels in between these lines of code. Sometimes it just needs a little extra white space to drag that into. All right, so once we have that all set up, we have our custom table view cell, but we're not telling the table view to use that. So let me go back to our single code view, go down here, and so where we're dequeuing the cell, this is just going to come out as a regular UITableView cell. So it's the same thing as if we did UITableView cell like this, declaring this as the type, but we don't want to do that. We want obviously our custom table view cell. Okay, and then it's gonna ask me to force unwrap that. So just go ahead and just have Xcode do that for me. And then now that we have these options, I can kind of get rid of this. And actually I'm going to change this because we're going to call this our main. Okay, so we're going to call this main text view or main label, and then on the text, we're going to put that text back in. Okay, and then our next one was our date label, and set the text to that one to, let's say, I don't know, January 1 at 3:30, whatever you want to put in that data. And then finally it was our description label, set the text to that. Okay, here's our description. Boom. And then again, if you have our image, so our image view, we can set that to some kind of UI image. Actually, set the image on the image view. There we go. And then give it some image within your project. I'm just going to comment that out for sake of time. But now you can see that we're going to have, once I compile this, oops, I got to remove this. If you remember, that's not the way we're going to do it, because we're already unwrapping it here. And this is okay because I know, because it crashed last time I fixed it, that when I dequeue an identifier here, I know that this identifier corresponds to the custom table view cell that we're pulling out, that we set that class on this and gave it the same item, the identifier. Oh, okay. So I named our image view the same thing as the superclass. So we don't want to do this. But an easy fix is if you go ahead and name this, it'll break the connection here to our UI, but our UI will still be trying to point to this one. So that'll not work. So I'm going to right click on that, go to refactor and rename. Yeah, got to be very careful about naming these very generic things. I'm just going to call this custom image view because we have a little bit of collision on the naming. It just says, oh, can't override strong property with weak property. That tells me nothing about what's actually going on, but I know for a fact that image view exists in our UITableView cell class as well. So anyway, if I rerun this, all should be working. Okay, so you can see that we now have different labels on our each one of our table views or table view cells, and if we add an image, that would go there as well. So let's clean this up a little bit, make it a little bit more presentable. So for instance, our date, we might want to have that in a slightly different font. If we go to our attributes for that label, maybe kind of expand this a little bit here. Okay, so right now it's at system font 17. Let's make our main label maybe a font size 22, and let's make it a bold. So go to style, maybe bold. Again, make it the main. And then for our date, we might have a different color, maybe a light or dark gray. Let's do dark gray for this one. And maybe make it maybe a lighter and maybe smaller font, something like that. And then this is going to be our description. Our description label might actually have a little bit more text in it, so we can increase the line count on that. And we can also do, instead of having a fixed size font, we can set a minimum font size. And what that'll do is if there's more text that fills that label, it'll make it smaller until all of that font fits in there. And here's another trick I want to show you. If I hold down Command Shift and then L, I can select let's type in UI view. I can get just a generic UI view and put a sub view in here. Sub views are kind of nice because we can get a reference to the view itself and either make it visible or invisible and everything. All the children views, such as labels and buttons within it, will be hidden. So it's a really nice way of hiding multiple UI elements all in one go. But what I'm going to use it for is I am going to kind of move this so we can get centered here. I am going to change the background color to, let's say, a black color. And then I am going to make the height, it's easier to do it on the panel here. I'm going to make the height, let's say 3 pixels, and the width, let's say 200. Then I'm going to move it right below our main label and drag it over, say about there. And then we're going to set up our constraints just like normal. So make sure you're sending it to the content view and not the main view because it's within the cell. So leading, trailing, and I'm going to make the vertical. So click and drag to the main label, which is the one above it, the vertical spacing. So set that little vertical spacing. I'm actually going to drag this right below that so we have the same kind of order with our labels. Doesn't really matter, but I like to keep it organized and know what I'm talking about. And then the height, we got to put a constraint on the height. So I'm going to click down here, click height, 3 pixels, perfect, add that constraint. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add in another view, but for instance, I'm going to make this a vertical. And again, I'm going to go over here, just make that. Let's make this 1 pixel. Set the background to maybe a dark gray instead. And I'm going to drag this up right to the borders of our cell. And again, because this is kind of 1 pixel wide, I like to do it from the left-hand side here. So we're going to do the top space and then the bottom space. Set the width this time. So width is going to be constant, but the height's going to change. And then it needs to know along the x-axis where to go. So I'm going to match it up to our image view and do horizontal spacing. And that'll make sure all the red marks go away. Okay, so we're going to compile this. All right, and just with a little bit of effort, you can see that our table view is looking a little bit more professional and looks like somebody actually gave it a little bit more thought. But I'm not liking the spacing on this. So what I can do is make sure that the custom cell's selected and maybe make it 150 pixels, or maybe it's a little bit too big. Maybe 140 is good. And you can see that that changed my constraints, but that's okay. I'm just going to move everything down. But because I don't want to have to select all 3 things again and move it down and play around with this, I am going to wrap everything in a subview. Looks like I lost my selection there. Select everything, go to editor, go to embed in, and I'm going to embed it in a view. You can do it without insets, and then you can hit all your constraints here. But what this allows me to do is now I can move my one view around, center that, resize that, and again, I have to reset all of my constraints. Okay, so a little bit of planning ahead will obviously be a lot better. You can always go up to this, sometimes it's yellow, sometimes it's red, depending upon the severity of it. And you can sometimes get a little bit of help from Xcode to fix these issues. So make sure you get rid of all these warnings because it will make your UI look different than it does in here. But I'm going to take a look and see what this looks like when we compile it. Okay, so we haven't set in our custom height. I did set it in our prototype, but I didn't set it in the code. So let's go back to that real quick and set it back to 140, run that real quick. And then I'll show you how to add a button. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better. I'll clean that up in a second. But you can see that this is looking a little bit more the way that we are wanting it to. The next thing I want to do is add a button to this. Now there's a slight problem with that because when you click on this button, where does that button click listener go? Where does it actually execute that code when you hit that button? Normally, it would be in your view controller, but this is a little bit different. So we got to do one more step in order to get that to work. So first, let's go ahead and create that button. I'm going to call this button just accept, depending upon what this actually does. The next thing we want to do is in our TableView cell code, in our custom TableView cell code. Let's make this a little bit larger so we can see. I need to get a reference to it. Or you can just add an action. I'm going to actually add an action. Drag it down here and just say button tapped, whatever you want to call it, of course. Now we have a function for our button tap. However, maybe our data is living in our view controller. So how do we call our view controller from our custom table view cell? Well, here's a trick for you. We're not actually going to do it this way, but normally this would how you would hook it up appropriately. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to select my button and I am going to go up to the connections tab and clear that connection. So you can see that that's no longer connected. So that's the way you can do it from the UI, but we're going to have to, if you want this called within your view controller, you have to select, or you have to do it manually. Okay, so we're gonna do our view controller, go up to automatic, select our view controller that controls this. Now, what I forgot to do, let's jump back real quick. Just hit the back button. Okay, and then we get back to here. I still need that reference to this button. Okay, so I'm calling this accept button. So we're going to use this when we set up each individual table row, because I need to know which button on which row you selected. So if we go back to the TableView cell, or the TableView controller, let's go back to our main thing here. When we're setting up our cell to handle all the data that we're going into, if I want to accept, let's say this is a meeting, if I want to accept this meeting just from the TableView cell, I need to know which button on which row was selected, right? So that we know which data to associate that button to click with. So here's what we're going to do. On our cell for our accept button, when that button is selected, we're going to add a target for that. Okay, so again, when it gets selected, that is we're going to set it up programmatically, and this is how you do it. So the target is asking who should I call, who should I let know that this button was selected. And in our case, it's going to be self, because we want to have it happen in the view controller. And then the next one, if you hit control / you'll get the next placeholder. Okay, so the selector is going to be the function that we want to call back on. So the best thing to do is actually define this before doing this. So I'm going to have just call it row button was tapped, and I want to know which button it is. And so we have a sender, and this can be any object, but you can also make it a UI button to be a little bit more specific. And when you set that to UI button, you get a little bit more functionality with the code complete, as well as being able to call functions that are specific to UI button as opposed to any function, which has a little bit of functionality. So once we have this method set up, now I can hit the pound selector, if I can spell it. This my font size is making this freak out on me. And then it's going to ask for an Objective-C method. One thing I forgot to do is add that Objective-C label to the top of this, just so we, just a little kind of internal stuff that we have to handle for function callbacks. But now that we have that already defined, I can autocomplete that, and it'll put in the signature for that method automatically, so you don't have to try to figure out how that syntax needs to be. Okay, so what we're going to do is when this accept button is tapped, we're going to call back on self, and we're going to call this method, and it's going to ask for which event. Well, this one we can just do, if you just hit the dot, it'll give you all the UI control events here, and the one we want is touch up inside. Okay, so when you touch down and then lift your finger up within the button border, this one will get called. All right, and then this one, once we have that set up, every single button in every single row, when we tap it, we'll call this code. The problem is we don't know which button is called, and so you can set up a whole bunch of elaborate schemes, but the best way that I've found and the most generic is to just set the tag on the cell. And the tag is just an integer, as you can see. And what I like to do is set it to the index paths row, because oftentimes when you're iterating through an array in order to display those array elements in a table view, it's usually the index at 0 is the first row, and etc. So if you have a different schema, this might work a little bit different. But if you just have an array and you're just displaying that array just flat out, this is the best way, because this is saying that I'm going to set the cells tag, actually, excuse me, I want to set the cells accept button its tag, because what's going to happen is now this is set. If this is the first row, it's going to be 0. If it's the second row, this is going to be 1, right? Because we have our offset at 0. It's basically going to give each row a number corresponding to the exact row that it's in. And because we're sending in the sender, I now have I can make a constant called row index, and this is going to be of type int, and I can set that to the sender's tag. And that way I know exactly which item in my array has been selected. And of course we can do something with that. Okay, put a little comment in there so you can remember what we're talking about here. And what I'm also going to do is I'm just going to print this out. So print out the row index. And let's see what this looks like. All right, so here's our custom rows. If I, let's go and make sure we can see our debug window first. Okay, so if I hit, let's choose, this will be 0, 1, 2. We have 2, we have 1, we have 3. Okay, so if you did have actual real data, you can act on that data because now we know which button corresponds to which row that we're in. Okay, so I'm gonna just go back and make sure that our UI looks appropriate, and then we're gonna wrap up. So in order to fix all these different elements here, you have to reset the constraints because the constraints were set to the content view, and now that they're in this child view, all my constraints get a little messed up here. Actually, okay, so make sure everything is under that child view. Didn't look like it captured everything, and it totally just messed everything up. So let me go ahead and I'll fast forward through this, but you can see how I'm just gonna fix all these constraints on here. All right, so resetting constraints are always a little fun. Sometimes it's just better to wipe out all the constraints and reapply them. So now we have our custom table view looking very nice, and as you can imagine, you can go all out with this. I can set the background of our view here to something else, like instead of white, we can set it to clear and show what's ever in the background, or I can set it to maybe dark gray, and that'll just do that one view that's nested. I'll show you what that looks like really quickly. But as you can see, this is how to fully control your cells within a TableView cell. So that's all I have for you. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative to you and it helped you in your next project. If you did, subscribe, like, and share it amongst your friends, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks.